Bom dia, pessoal. Bom dia a todos. Teremos hoje, então, mais um seminário FAMB. E eu tenho o prazer, na verdade, de apresentar a Mariela, que será quem vai conversar com a gente hoje. E bom dia, Mariela.
Bom dia, Juliana.
E aí, para nossa felicidade, para facilitar um pouquinho, a Mariela fala português, então vou apresentá-la em português aqui. A Mariela é professora da Escola de Física da Universidade da Costa Rica, em São José. Tem doutorado em Física Médica pela Universidade de Wisconsin e pós-doutorado na Virginia Commonwealth University. Desde 2019, ela coordena o Laboratório de Física Médica Computacional, SICANUM, da Universidade da Costa Rica, e atualmente é aluna de pós-graduação em tempo parcial do programa de mestrado em Linguística da mesma universidade e uma amante de artes. Ela se interessa por simulação dos transportes de radiação, análise de imagens, educação científica e transdisciplinaridade, incluindo linguagem, artes e ciências. Como eu disse, é um prazer ter a Mariela aqui. Eu conheci a Mariela quando eu fiz um pequeno estágio também lá na Universidade de Wisconsin. Ela se tornou uma grande amiga, justamente por falar português. Foi me apresentada logo no aeroporto. Mas aí, de lá para cá, a gente manteve algum pequeno contato, criamos uma amizade legal de lá para cá. Então, por isso, eu fico muito feliz de estar aqui hoje, Mariela, te apresentando. Eu nem vou contar tudo que a gente fez por lá, né? Porque é isso aqui, a gente vai passar vergonha, mas é muito bom ter você aqui com a gente. E poder ouvir a sua experiência hoje vai ser bem interessante para todo mundo. Muito obrigada, Mariela. Eu acho que se você quiser colocar a sua apresentação.
Ok. Muito prazer, Juliana, para mim estar aqui com vocês. Eu falo português, como a Juliana disse, mas eu falo português uma vez cada 10 anos, então vou fazer a apresentação em inglês. Então, vou tentar falar despacio, porque meu português não vai ficar muito bom. Então, vou falar em inglês.
Fique à vontade, Mariela.
Tudo ao final pode ser em português, não tem problema. Então...
Enquanto você coloca a sua apresentação aí, eu tenho que comentar que eu estou recebendo uma mensagem também de um colega aqui, dizendo que fez o sanduíche dele na Universidade de Wisconsin e fez aulas com você também. Talvez você se recorde do Theo. Ele deve estar aqui assistindo.
Acho que sim, porque tem ele fez o lab com o Zagzebski, do ultrassom.
Pode ser. Aí...
Acho que pode ser.
Mas então, estamos em casa, ó, 2 amigos aqui, Mariela. Fique à vontade, pode começar a sua apresentação.
Pode olhar a apresentação lá?
Sim, sim.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming today, for being here this morning. I am going to present some tools to help students maximize their learning. And in my case, for me, this is very important because as an instructor, there's a lot of things that we learn how to do as scientists, but we don't have that many chances to learn how to be instructors when we're in college, in university. So one thing that I always like to teach my students about being a scientist is that sometimes you have to be, well, most of the time you have to be an instructor as well. So this is just a way for me to summarize a lot of things that I've learned throughout the years and things that I've researched. I'm very interested in scientific education research. So one thing that I really like is to summarize things and try to make it friendly for physicists in a way. Most of my colleagues are physicists, so we don't necessarily know a lot about theoretical theory of education and things like that. So we want sometimes to have more practical tips and something that is more practical to use in the everyday today life. And a lot of times the tips are geared towards instructors, like what can we do as teachers to help our students? And a lot of that are from the point of view of the teacher. But there are not that many, I think, resources that are physicist friendly that help us instructors understand things that could help our students more directly, like when they're studying by themselves. Like a lot of times is stuff about the classrooms, how you can do different things in classroom to help them. But this is something that not necessarily translates well into what the students are going to do by themselves. So my presentation, it's an attempt to do that, to give instructors an idea of things that could help our students when their students are by themselves. So it's a little bit of a different point of view than other presentations, in my opinion. So, okay, so we know that we are participants in the learning process. We know that we as instructors, as teachers, we have a role to bridge our students to the materials that they're learning, so the materials in the class that we're teaching. And we know that the students are also part of this process. Otherwise, the learning process just would not be able to advance. There wouldn't be any learning in going. In my opinion, I think even if we are, and here I'm talking as an instructor, but sometimes I put myself in the shoes of the student. But like, we've all had really good instructors, and we've all had really bad instructors when we were students. So I think that even if we have a bad instructor, if we know how to be good students, like, we can overcome a lot of obstacles that might come our way. And as instructors, I think we should always strive to be good instructors, but sometimes our methods or our way of working, it doesn't really go with how our students need to learn. So it's always good to give them other tools besides what we use in our class. And in that sense, that's how I argue that the student's role is just as important as instructor, but even more probably. I would argue that it's a little bit more important, because we are the ones, as students, are the ones that are doing the learning. So our guidance as instructors is really necessary so that goes well. But sometimes it can just be a guidance. That's the only thing that we can give our students. And sometimes if we look at our students, we might think either graduate or undergraduate. Like, I work with graduate students in the master's program, and I also have undergraduate students in the physics school. I also teach a class for students in medical sciences. So I teach both classes throughout the year. So I have a population of graduate and undergraduate, and there's some differences. But if we look at students in general, we tend to think that our students and our former students are successful because we think, well, like, they've already are in a really good institution in our countries. They're getting good grades, likely. Sometimes if they're not getting good grades, we might just say, like, they're bad students. I argue against that, but let's just pretend that we're thinking about, like, the successful case of a student that achieved higher education, is getting good grades. They got into competitive graduate programs. Like, it wasn't easy for them to become part of our master's program, let's say. So they might they've already undergone a lot of things that make us think that they're very successful. And I don't know how this works in Brazil. In the US, they have, after master's or after PhD in medical physics, they do a residency, a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, depending on the program, on the residency program. And it takes a lot of competition to get into one of these residencies. Like, it's really hard to find a place. So maybe we think of our students like, oh, maybe they already got this residency, so they've already shown even more proof that they're successful, that they learn. There's a lot of these exams. We don't have these exams for residencies in Costa Rica, but really at the end of graduation, if they all get clinical positions or academic or in industry positions, then we tend to think of them as successful. Like yeah, they achieved their goal of getting a job in a good place. But at the same time, that's true. They are successful. Like this, it's not a trivial accomplishment to do all that. It takes a lot of hard work. But the truth is that the things that they've done to accomplish that are based on things that we know from before, and the challenges that they will encounter in their work in, well, I'm calling here the 21st century, but like really like everything that goes on from here on are going to be very different than the challenges that we have been encountering in the past. And particularly the rate at which those challenges is going to happen, it really is going much quicker. I think proven point, like 2 years ago, we did not know that we were going to be in a pandemic situation. So that's a new challenge that I had no idea how to overcome based on my previous education. Like I have to figure it out. We all had to figure it out on our own. So the idea for me is to how can we give our students tools to overcome those obstacles in a better way, whatever that means. Better is a very subjective term, but in a better way than what we have done so far, because the challenges are going to be different and the challenges are going to be coming up quicker. Like there are going to be more challenges coming up. And one thing that I argue as a students, as our instructors, we can give our students is that we can help them not carry non-efficient learning techniques from their past, because we're going to have to keep learning, and our students, especially after we're gone, they're going to have to keep learning even more things more quickly as they come. And what I think is that a lot of times we carry these very non-efficient learning techniques from our previous experience based on things that we've learned throughout our education. And we most of the time we learn things through trial and error. So if we were, and we use exams as a barometer of success. So if I studied in a way when I was in first grade in school and I got good grades, then I would just keep studying that way. And if I didn't get good grades, then maybe I will change the way to study, or like the teacher might suggest something and so on. And so I learned in a mostly trial and error kind of way, not really based on any scientific evidence. Like maybe the teacher might know, but it was mostly of a more instinctive kind of way. Like I'm just going to try this, or like maybe talking to another colleague, like, oh, I need to do this other thing differently. But really it's mostly trial and error. It's just that a lot of this trial and error happens when we're very little. So we might not think of it as that way. We might just be thinking, like, well, I'm just learning how to read. But we do carry all of those techniques for really the rest of our lives, I would argue. And the other thing is that when the teacher suggests things to do differently, there might be good intentions, and if they are really professionals in education, they might have really good sources to base their advice from, like scientific sources to say, like, oh, to justify, like, this is the right way to do things, or this is the best way to do approach a certain material and so on. But most of the time, and I would argue for university teachers, that would be mostly true. We would give as students and we would get as students really bad habits from former teachers, because again, this is the trial and error process of our teachers, and that it's being transmitted to our students. Like I said, like I talk of myself as a student and as a teacher kind of at the same time, because really, like right now in my life, I am a student and I'm also a professor. So it's really my reality right now. But also because when I think about this material, I think of as a teacher. When I teach, I think of materials as the teacher. This is what I want to teach. This is my learning objective. But then I also try to put myself in the shoes of the student. So I think it's not necessarily, I hope I'm not being confusing by switching my persona back and forth. But I really think it's a good skill to have when planning a class, because you also want to know what your students might be thinking, or you might want to think like, why would I have thought about this if I had been my own student? So it's kind of a not very easy thing to do necessarily, but I think it's a good exercise. And with time, as you go and do this more often, it becomes more natural. So back to the idea, as instructors, sometimes we might give a student advice, but that advice might be based on our own trial and error. So it's not also an advice that might have been really grounded, really well grounded in science, let's say. It's just like, well, you should do more practice. But we don't tell them maybe how they can make this practice better or more efficient. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean with efficiency later on. But we might just give them this very well-intentioned advice, and this advice that worked well for us, but we don't really know how good this really was for us. Like, it just worked because we got good grades, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this was the best way to do things, like quote unquote the best way. So the sad thing for me is that both students and we as former students, or I would argue also current students, the students are not really aware that they're not using the full capabilities. Because again, if we use the barometer of success, an exam, we use an exam as a barometer of success, then if they got good grades, then we think everything is great. Like, no, you're doing fine. But the problem is that sometimes, and this is like a whole different talk, but the problem is that you can, as an instructor, you can kind of plan an exam for students to get like really good grades, or you can plan an exam for all students to get really bad grades. Like, you have so much power in how you do the evaluation that, let's say, like if a teacher does, let's say, an easy evaluation, whatever that means, but let's say it's something that's just like fast to understand. Just a quick example. So if I do a very easy exam, then I would expect all my students to get good grades. And if I do a very hard exam, I would at least not be surprised if all my students get bad grades. Like, maybe I would not be happy about it, but I wouldn't have to be surprised if I make them intentionally hard. So I don't think exams are on their own are a key way to, or are the best way to deem if learning has been successful. It's a tool that we have. It's really, I don't have a really good solution to that right now, but I think that they're not necessarily the best way, because as instructors, we can kind of do many different things, make it very easy, make it very hard. But okay, that's the tool that we have, and it's not an easy problem to solve. But what can we do so that at least, regardless of the exam we do, our students are able to learn not just for our exams, but for life, for later on? And how do we help them achieve that full capability that they might have? I talk about this concept of efficient learning. And efficient learning, it's not really a scientific term. Like, this is something I came up with because it's an easy way to talk about this. And it's based really on the meaning of efficient. And this means that it's something that's capable of producing results that are desired, but where we're not going to be wasting any resource. So we're not wasting materials, time, or energy. In our case, time would be the most valuable resource that we have. And I'm thinking about learning as that long-term retention and recall of knowledge. And I also want to add something that's really not on the slide, but I also think it's important. And that recall is not just like remembering something like, oh, like remembering a phone number or something that's very memoristic. But that recall is also, what I mean by recall here is recalling something, remembering something, and being able to use it in a new situation. So this is more of that creative aspect of learning. And that's when we know that learning has taken place, like that it's been learned in a really good way. So we not only just not forget the idea that we had, but we also are able to remember and use it in a creative way, not just use it in the same way we use it all the time, but use it creatively. And that creatively part is that what really makes the difference in terms of advancement of knowledge, really, for humankind. Let's just put it in a more heroic way, but that's really what we do as scientists. We advance knowledge. So this is a really key aspect of learning for us, because not just remembering things, that's not just enough. We really have to be able to use it in a very creative way. So we really want our students, we cannot do that creative part for them, but we can help them with that long-term retention and that recall, that we can help them figure that out. And that's why I'm going to be giving you all some strategies to help your students accomplish that. And we want to do this in a very, what I like to say, an efficient way, an efficient use of time, not just the instructor's time, but also the student's time. So I think that's, for me, that's a key aspect, because there might be many ways to accomplish this learning process for long term and everything, but if they take a long time, then the students are not going to do them, because they only have one semester for the class. They have a limited amount of time. The instructors also don't have enough time to plan the class, to teach the class, and to help the students figure a lot of things out. We cannot, if we have a class of 50, 100 people, we cannot, maybe we cannot sit down with each student and figure out what's going on with them. So for me, it's not just learning, but it also needs to be efficient, because otherwise it might not happen, even if we know exactly what we have to do. If it's not an efficient thing that we can do in the limited time that we have, then it's just not going to happen, because people are going to be like, I don't have time for this, and I just need to get a good grade on the exam and keep going. So it needs to be not just good learning, but it also needs to be efficient learning. And that's why I like to keep that idea of efficient learning, even though it's not a scientific term. It's really not something that you're going to be finding in literature. So this is really a subjective term that I came up with, so that I could talk about this for my students in talks and that sort of thing. So don't Google it, because probably you won't find anything that talks about this in this language, but it's just an easy way for me to explain what I'm all about, and it's learning in an efficient manner without wasting a lot of time. And our motivation as instructors is, well, yes, it's part of our job, but we also want our students to be lifelong learners, and we want to make a positive impact on how they learn during their professional lives. And if we help them with the learning part, we help them be a little bit more creative during our classes, let's say, then we're going to be helping them achieve these skills that are needed during their professional lives to come up with solutions to the different challenges that the world is going to throw at them in the future, and that keeps throwing at us right now. So if we want to make this learning, this whole process more efficient, we should also be able to teach our students how to take advantage of our teaching. We should also give them some guidance, because maybe we are doing a lot of effort planning our classes. Maybe we're doing we learn a lot about how active learning techniques are better for the students, and we plan exercises in our classes, and we plan demonstrations, and we do all kinds of really good, really scientifically based activities that we can do for our students to learn. But then if the students don't know how to approach the material on their own, then I think that makes all of our efforts be lost, because the students are not going to be able to take full advantage of what we did in class. So if we do a great activity in class, like active learning techniques, and it's great, and then the students go home, and if they're only going to be rereading the book, then it doesn't really help to cement in the brain the skills that we help them develop during the activity in class. So it's really a way of complementing our efforts and give the students some guidance so that they can take full advantage of the material on their own, but also so that they can take more advantage of the stuff that we do in class for them. So what I do first here is I'm going to be talking about some common techniques, some learning strategies that are usually common, and I'm going to give them kind of like a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And when I give a thumbs down, it doesn't mean that it's bad. What I'm trying to keep in mind here is that it's like it needs to be like efficient learning. So am I be giving something a thumbs down just because it's inefficient or because it's not long term? The results are not going to be long term, the benefits of this. So I will give some of them like stars, and those are the ones that I consider are more are more in line with this efficient learning concept. So the very first technique, and a lot of these techniques I took out from a paper by Dunlowski. It's not as recent, but I think it's very it summarizes things very well, and I think a lot of the research later on has actually supported a lot of the things that were summarized there. So these are not things that I researched. These are really things that have been researched throughout many years by different educational researchers. So I would, if somebody is interested, I'm more than happy to provide a copy of this paper because I think it's really useful. And a lot of the materials that I took, that I use in this presentation, I took out from Dunlowski. So the first thing that we might normally do, and not just the students, but somebody who's trying to remember something that maybe we want to teach a class or we want to remember some concepts. So the first thing that students might do is rereading the material. So read the book, essentially read the book many times. That's very easy to implement. That's a very easy thing to do. Problem is that the results are not necessarily going to be long-term. That this is something that could make the students think that they know the material because they might have these ideas fresh in their brains, but then longer term, if they only reread the material, then they're not going to be able to remember the stuff. So this is one thing that doesn't have that long-term results that we want to see in true learning in this environment. The other thing is that this is not necessarily bad. It just needs to be used with more active strategies, which we're going to see in a little bit. So rereading is the most natural thing I think to do. Is the thing that sometimes we do the most. We might just like reread and reread and reread when we're trying to study, but it's really not the best way to put the ideas into the brain for longer term. The other technique that sometimes is used along rereading is highlighting. Like when you're like highlighting the text and you say this idea is important, so I'm going to mark it. And this one, it feels less passive than rereading. But this is kind of like an illusion that the brain plays on us because we're doing something with our hand. It gives the brain kind of an idea that we are doing something. But really, in terms of this being something in the brain, it is really as passive as rereading. It's not really something that is engaging for the brain. So it gives some sense that we're covering material, you know, like after you finish, you look at all the stuff that you highlighted and say like, yes, I did finish reading this chapter. And you might think you're accomplished, but I don't think it's a very active way to learn, and it's not something that is going to be helpful long term. And one thing that it's mentioned in the literature is that it might actually hinder connection of ideas across a text, because I see this each idea kind of as a little unit. So then if I have an idea in one part of the chapter and an idea in another part of the chapter, reading in this way, and just highlighting it, because I'm reading in a linear way and I'm highlighting things here and there, it might not be helpful for kind of mixing connections, and that mixing is where the creative stuff happens. Like if we just look at the ideas separately, we're not going to be able to find connections and other ideas, or like link it to things that we already know from before and so on. So highlighting, it's kind of like, for me, it's more of a soothing, like something to feel good doing. And so it's okay as a starting point. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying do not tell your students to highlight. Like they can all do all these things, reread and highlight, and that's okay. But we should be able to tell them, that this is really not the best way to use their time. Like it's fine if they use it as a starting point. Like, for example, in my own practice to study, what I do is I might highlight ideas as I go, and then I do another read using the more active techniques. But now I'm kind of already thinking that this is an idea that I think it's important. So highlighting helps me find the idea in the text more quickly, but it's really not the only thing I do. So it's okay as a starting point. It's okay if we're reading something, if you're reading something for the first time, to highlight so that you can find ideas more quickly. But it's like highlighting is not studying, is what I'm trying to say. It's really not the same thing as learning. The other technique that it's summarizing is actually really good if the person knows how to do summaries. It's a really good way to learn. But the reason why I give it a thumbs down is because it requires a lot more time than other more successful strategies. And if you're going to do like a summary, a really good summary is going to be like a literature review of different sources. So if you're reading say one book chapter, like physics book, then yeah, like summarizing what you learn and all that is going to be a really good technique to learn the concepts and to remember the ideas. But the problem is that like if you're going to do a summary, you're essentially like kind of rewriting the chapter. Like it would be smaller in extension, but it takes a long time to write something. Like you have to do all this, put all these ideas and organize them. So if you're only just like doing like a summary, just like little snippets of text, again, will be the same kind of as highlighting. Like you're just gonna copy and paste different things and in the text. So maybe you're writing with your own words, but it's really, there's no connection between things. So a good summary is really good, but making a good summary requires a lot more time than other strategies that are just as successful or even more successful that are better in a way. So summarizing, a lot of students sometimes they do summaries to study, and I tell them that that's fine if you have time, but if you don't have time, that's really not the best way that you could be doing. And sometimes they might start doing summaries in the beginning of the semester, and as the semester goes on, they might get overwhelmed by all the material that they have to do in other classes. So then there's just no way for them to have time. In a lot of the times during our classes, the amount of credit hours that they have for each class, it's not really enough to do summaries of everything. So I think it's a good strategy when we know how to use it, because if we don't know how to do good summaries, then it can actually backfire. You waste a lot of time and you didn't really learn all that much. But if it's done well, it could be very useful. It's just not very efficient. I think there are other ways to be more efficient and achieve the same learning process in a quicker amount of time. Other learning strategies that students might use and that I like to group as mental imagery techniques. One is, for example, associating a word with associating concepts or lists of words with keywords. So this is very used in anatomy, for example, or when you're learning vocabulary for in history or like learning a language or any kind of a thing where you want to remember a lot of things in a sequence or whatever, like things that you have to memorize. It's very useful. Problem is that it might be short term, so it's not necessarily something that we could probably use for a lot of physics ideas that we have. So maybe for things like units, or maybe for things like some concepts of definitions and so on, maybe formulas, but it's really not that useful for things other than very memoristic stuff. So I don't. It's a way that it's a thing that the students might use. Particularly, I work with medical students in one of my in the undergrad class I teach, and they use it a lot. And I know, like in anatomy, I use it a lot as well. But the problem with that is that the benefits are going to be short term. So if it's something that you're not going to be using often, it's going to be lost very quickly. So it might be good for the exam, and then the next semester, like the knowledge is gone. So it wasn't like, if it's not there anymore, I would argue that if you forgot something, you didn't know it. Like you did it for the exam, you were able to regurgitate that material for the exam, but you didn't really know it. Like you didn't learn it. So I think that these are good starting points, but again, because the benefits are short term, they're not necessarily good ways to spend your time learning things. It might be useful for some cases, but again, we have to keep in mind that the benefits might be short term, so it's not very efficient way to learn. And a very related technique there is what's called imagery for text. And this is actually a very entertaining, very enjoyable technique to use, in which we come up with this mental images, like maybe even stories, whatever you want, to remember something, to remember a text, to remember concepts. And this one we can use for more complex stuff. And this one it's a really enjoyable one. But again, the benefit can also be short term, because we kind of have to remember the whole story so that we remember the concept. So it's not really efficient, because like, why wouldn't just be remembering the concept? Like, why do I have to study? Like, remember this whole story behind it. And it might require some more time to implement. And sometimes, and this is not something that I don't think Dungoski mentioned this, but something I encountered, like sometimes people cannot cannot come up with images in their head. And it's not something that that people might realize. Like sometimes people realize this when they're later in life, that they are not, like, some people are very able to come up with this like really vivid images, but other people are not. Like that's just how their brain is wired. So if we tell them like to do this, and it happens to be that they're one of these people that are not able to come up with mental images, it doesn't mean that they don't have visual processes. It doesn't mean, for me, it was very interesting when I learned about this. It's called aphantasia, and for me it was very interesting to learn, because I saw it first time I heard about this. It was somebody who works in graphics design, and she was saying that like she realized that she couldn't imagine this, and but that didn't mean that she couldn't do graphics work. Like she could design things. It just like it wasn't in her brain as an image in the same way as it was for her colleagues. And she realized this by talking to her colleagues. And for her, it was really eye-opening, because she didn't think that it wasn't a problem for her. It was just like she didn't come up with the images, but she could come up with the visual things in her work. So for me, it was very interesting to me, because it's just like the brain process things in a different way. But if we asked our students to come up with mental images, maybe they're not going to be able to do that. So I think that this is a nice way. Maybe it's something that we could use as a tool for teaching. Maybe we can tell our students a story. And if we're going to be telling a story, it's always good to include like various more of sentimental stuff, not like sad, but like more feelings in the story, and that helps the students like get more engaged with the material. But it's really not a technique that you want to use when you're studying, like if you're a student studying by yourself, because it takes a longer time to implement. And then the benefits might be short term, and sometimes because it's so enjoyable, like people just might go into it and like start coming up with these elaborate ideas and everything, and it just like becomes a hindrance to the learning process. So I think like these ones for me, mental imagery are things to be used in doses, like to use them more carefully and not try to use them for everything. So that's why I give them a thumbs down. Again, it's not that they're bad, it's just that they're not really efficient ways to use the time. And I've been talking about like the non-efficient ways to learn. So what are efficient ways to do things? And here I group the strategies in this active reading category, and there's another mindful techniques later on. But the first category for me would be active readings. And the first way to do active readings is to do this, what's called elaborative interrogation. And this is essentially just like keep asking why and keep asking questions. Most of the time that question in physics is going to be why, just like to do an explanation, but it could be other questions as well. And here is the part that's interesting for me here, and I think that this is something that's important to know when using this technique, is that it's okay if the answer is not correct in the beginning, because this is a technique that we're doing the first time we're reading the material. So this is not a technique, well, you could use it on rereading, but like the idea is that as you encounter the material for the first time, you start asking the questions right away. And so it's fine if the answer is not correct. So this feels like a slower way to read, but it's a better way to read because you're already like implanting in the brain the ideas. This actually helps students understand the material better and keep that material in their heads longer. So it really does help because you're kind of cementing the ideas, and there is this sense of urgency when you're asking something, why is that, or what is going on here? How does that do that? When you ask that kind of question, you are kind of telling the brain like, hey, this is important material. And so the brain kind of wants to grab that information. I think for me, I think it sounds like a joke. It's like a metaphor I like to use, is that like our brains are really good for, you know, running away from a tiger and that sort of thing. That's really what we do best. So learning for our ancestors, learning meant like whether I know where the tiger lives so that I don't go through there. I don't walk past the tiger's house. So if I learn that and I don't forget it, then I survive, and that's great. So if I don't learn it, then the tiger eats me. So for me, this is like whenever I ask a question, it's like telling the brain like, hey, this is really important, like, you know, and like kind of tags into that that mindset of like, oh, well, like this is really important information because otherwise the tiger eats me. So there's like more, it like gives the brain like say something like this is really important information, and the brain interprets that as it's important information for my survival, because that's really the system that's at play in a way. I'm not saying this like in a way that it's like stressful and panicky, like people are afraid of the tiger. I mean it in an everyday way. It's like you tell like, oh, you should not go there because far away there is where the tiger lives. Oh, okay, like, you know, it's not as stressful. Then you just like, okay, I'll just not go that way. So one thing here is that as we go and read the material for the first time, we keep asking these questions and try to answer them like off the top of our head, like just trying to come up with the answer. Like if I say, for example, if I say review of learning strategies, active reading, and then it says, oh, it says like it's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Why does she say that it's active reading is a good thing? Maybe, and like this is the way I'm answering, maybe is because let's just say that I think active is like you have to be exercising. So then maybe I say, oh, like maybe because if you're exercising, like the hormones make you happy and then you learn better. Maybe then maybe I keep reading about active reading and realize that was wrong. And so, oh no, it's not the exercise hormones. It's actually like it engages your brain in a different way. But you see, like just the fact that I had that idea and now it's wrong, it kind of tags into that saying like, wait, no, like you had it wrong. Like that's not the tiger's house. The tiger's house is the other way. I was like, oh, okay, then I need to remember that. It's important. So then that's just a way to engage more with the text that you're reading as a student. So even telling our students that they can do this, it's not something that we might necessarily as students have come up with, or the students that we have are not going to come up with this necessarily on their own. But if we tell them that this is something that they can do, And if we sprinkle questions even during our lectures, then it might help them have this process more in their heads. But I think that just like telling people that this is something that they can do and that's going to be very useful for them, and it's scientifically shown to help, it might not necessarily make all of the students do that, but it might help them. And even if you're going to do like a homework, for example, instead of asking them for a summary, you might ask them for like, oh, give me a list of questions that you came up with as you were reading the material. That might actually be a better use of their time if you're going to say give them a homework for something that you want them to read. Like, and I know in physics sometimes the thing that they have to read is really the book in physics or a textbook, but sometimes we might want them to summarize something, and we might want them to write an essay and that sort of thing. And there might be other ways in which we can do this homework and ask them to do this homework that helps them study better than just doing a summary. And in this technique, this elaborative interrogation also ties into another technique that's very similar, that's called self-explanation. And the difference here is that it's kind of like an elaborative interrogation, but more advanced in the sense that we also relate it to previous knowledge. We want to relate it to something that we already know from before. And in this case, one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that this is not, like, self-explanation is not the same as paraphrasing. It's different. Paraphrasing would be like saying something in my own words, and self-explanation is part of that. Like paraphrasing something might be part of the self-explanation, but it's really, self-explanation is relating this to previous knowledge. So just like changing the way words are said, the idea is said, then that doesn't really make for an active processing of the material as it relates to things that we knew from before, as it links to previous material. So this is something that to keep in mind, and this is a combination, this elaborative interrogation and the self-explanation. These are things that can be used in tandem, that can be used at the same time. So it's not that you have to choose one or the other. These are things that you could absolutely use even with highlighting, with rereading, but you can use all these techniques at the same time. But just asking the question, how does this relate to previous knowledge? Then that is engaging more actively in the material. That is a lot more active for the brain than just rereading something. One thing that, again, it's important to keep in mind is that if we're reading something for the first time, the answer might not be correct, but the idea is to keep that answer somewhere. You write it down, and then just like think about it again later on and say like, oh no, I was wrong in this. Like, I should have done this other thing. Or maybe if you discuss it or ask the professor in class and so on. So for example, one way we could, as instructors, help our students do this is the kind of questions that we ask them for homework or for reflection in class. Maybe if instead of asking, for example, what is this thing, like, a concept, a definition, maybe we can ask, how does this definition relates to the stuff that we know, that I know they learned from the class before? How does this relate to other things that they know? And we can make variations of this general question that are more tailored for our class, and that actually helps them process that material in a more active way. And this is something that we do as we're reading, but that we can also incorporate in our lectures, and that we can tell our students that they can do, because this is not something that students are going to come up with independently. Like, that you kind of have to tell them. And I'm almost going to be sure that most people, if not all people, have never used this before in their studies. The other set of techniques that I think are for me the stars of this are what I call the mindful practice. The mindful practice, and these are going to be the last set of techniques. And one is practice testing, and this one is different testing than what we do for evaluation. This one is using tests as a learning tool, and these are tests that you want to do. You can do them in class if you want. The best is that they are not part of the evaluation. These are just as a way for students to get accustomed to how the material they need to But this is something that they can also incorporate in their practice. The students can also incorporate in practice. And this is, again, a little bit like that, keep asking questions as you read. In this sense, it could be like you're reading and you might try to do some problem in physics, problems, talking like a general physics kind of class. It's good to be able for students to try to remember from memory, even if it's not like the first time they answer, it's not the great answer, but if they keep asking that question more than once and try to recall, or I can just be like, oh, what was that concept we saw in class again? Oh yeah, that's it. Or like, oh, I don't remember. And then I might look it up and it's like, oh, okay, that's what it is. So then I will have longer term benefits than if I just like try to remember. It's like, it's this and this and this. It's this and this and this. It's this and this. Okay, I learned it already. And this practice testing has something that I really like, that it can be implemented in note taking. So as we go, we write down the question. So we can just keep doing this practice testing from the notes that we already took in class. We can also throw, as professors, we can also throw questions in there. And it helps the students assign this priority to the contents. And then in the concept of physics classes, we might have a lot of practice problems, or even in master's classes, they're going to have to do some math problems for studying calculations and that sort of thing. And usually, for me, the archetypical thing is here is a general physics book. And that's what I like to talk, because most people are familiar with that. So that you have one topic and you have a whole bunch of problems on that topic. So like if you're a student, you're gonna sit down and like do like problem 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the problems in that section. The problem with that is that it kind of gives the student an idea that they learn something, because they're kind of mastering the same skill over and over again, but they're not able to mix skills. But if you use, like, let's say that you have to study problems from 2 sections, let's just say it's 10 problems. Instead of doing like in a sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then like the next section, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you mix them up from the different sections, and you do like, I want to do 1 from section 1, and then 2 from section 2, and then 3 from section 1, and you kind of mix them up, you're going to use pretty much the same amount of time to practice, but you're going to be able to find what your deficiencies are in learning, what your capabilities are for real, and that will have longer term benefits, because the student might be saying like, oh wait, I don't understand this, so I'm gonna have to go back and review the material. But in the end, like, they're gonna learn more, and the differences in time, maybe in the beginning might be harder to remember some things, but as you go, you're gonna have all the skills at once, as opposed to just like one skill and then the other skill. In mixing things up, you're gonna have a lot more range of skill to develop at the same time. So you're developing more skills during more time. And finally, the very last one that I want to show here is what's called interleave practice. And this is really similar to distributed practice. And it's the same thing. It's just that here we're going to be mixing across subjects. And what this is really good at, although I guess maybe the research is not as complete as in the other techniques, but what they're looking at this is because it seems to remove that illusion of learning. And what I tell the illusion of learning to my students is my students are Spanish speakers for the most part. And so I tell them like, well, if I speak Portuguese or Italian, you might understand what I'm saying. But that does not mean that you speak Portuguese or that you speak Italian. So it's that illusion. Like if we are very familiar with the material, if we're doing problems in the same topic, in the same class, then I might think like, yes, I'm really good at this because I have all the concepts in my head. But then if I mix them up, then I might realize like, wait, this concept is not really that cemented into my brain. So that's really that's something that we want to do, like to remove that illusion of learning in our students, will help them figure out their own limits. And this is something harder to do in class or help them up with that. This is something that we can tell them that they can do. But I think that we could use distributed practice and in a way interleave practice if we bring other subjects, other topics in class. And it doesn't mean that we have to teach a chemistry class in the middle of physics class, but if we just throw them the ideas like this is linked to chemistry, or this is like, or if we just say like, do you remember what we saw last year about, or last time about this other thing? So if we throw like ideas from before or things that they're probably familiar with from other classes, then we're helping them figure out what their limits are and remove this illusion of learning. So finally, and really just to help use a little bit of recall in this session, the most efficient ways, I think, for learning for me are practice testing, distributed practice, and interleave practice, all these mindful practice techniques. And they're really good if you complement them with elaborative interrogation and self-explanation. And you can see that some of them are more appropriate when we're doing readings of materials, and some of them are more appropriate when we're doing practice of material. But practice doesn't always mean, problems like physics problems. It could be questions about other kinds of materials. And rereading doesn't always mean like reading text. Sometimes it could mean looking at slides. Sometimes it could mean looking at some other kind of material that's not necessarily a textbook. And other techniques like what we saw, like rereading and highlighting in the beginning, summarizing, might be okay, but they're really not that good use of time and are going to be less successful as long-term recall. So you really want to, I think, at least I prefer to focus on most efficient techniques that these mindful techniques are, and just complement them with this active reading techniques. And that concludes my presentation. So here's some references that I use, and I know the letter is really small, so I'm happy to provide any reference in here to somebody who's interested. And that's it. I cannot hear you, Juliana. I don't know if anybody can hear.
Melhor agora?
Uhum.
Obrigada pela apresentação. Eu estou aqui pensando nas maneiras como eu sempre estudei ou como eu ensino hoje. Me pensar bastante. A gente tem algumas perguntas aqui.
Okay. Can teaching friends be a form of active learning? Yes. So one thing I like to tell my students is to try to study in groups. And that's not just so that they can talk about the material and ask them questions, but also so that they can tell the other colleague the material, like, this is what I learned, and like, this is what I understand. And just like going that back and forth, that discussion actually helps the brain. It's like this social thing. Like if Juliana tells me that there's a sale in the mall, in the store, then I'm going to be like, oh, that's really important information. Let's go. So there is a social motivation to keep that knowledge in my head. It can be silly knowledge, but it can be really important knowledge. Like, no, the teacher said this thing in class that it was going to be in the test. So then that becomes that social aspect of learning. And it's been really hard during the pandemics. Like, I know that for a fact, to have that social aspect of learning. And one thing I did for my classes during the pandemics, not the very first exam I thought last year, but in pandemics mode. But now what I tell them is, like, do a study group from the very beginning. Like, we're gonna sit down and we're gonna take some minutes in class and we're gonna do a studies, like try to come up with study buddies so that you can all meet every once in a while, even if it's just by chat or like leaving messages, like just to have some kind of social environment to learning. So yes, absolutely, it can be a form of active learning. Yep. If done correctly, like if you're just parroting out the ideas, then it does, like if you're memorizing it, it's like the concept of this is this and this and this. Like, it doesn't really work that well. But if you're studying, like, what do they mean by this and that? Oh, is that the same as the other thing that we saw in the other class? Like, yeah, I think it is. If that's that kind of dialogue, then yes.
Okay. One more question.
Mm-hmm. How do you deal with the obligation of completing a syllabus in opposition to real learning, to the use of different techniques that allow the student to understand and retain the knowledge? I begin by not seeing these things in opposition. Like, so I know sometimes they feel like they are. I teach a class that it's 16 weeks of teaching, and it's 15 topics. It's ridiculous. It's like it's a physics class for medical students. And like first week is vectors, next week is cinematics, then third week is forces. So it's like, it's like, it's horrible in terms of how much time you have for each topic. So one thing that I did, because it's so much material, is I use like, for that kind of material, I found that like flipping classrooms helps a lot, but I also try to distill the knowledge, like what is the really important thing for me to tell them. And sometimes like the really important thing is to show them what is force. Force is this, and these are the units. And maybe that's the really important thing that I want them to remember. And then what I do is the rest of the class is tell them how to, or show them ways to use that concept to figure out questions, to come up with solutions to problems. But I'm not going to be talking in class about, Isaac Newton and like his ideas, and like I'm not going to be doing problems in solve problems. I don't like doing that many demonstrations in my class, like solving problems. I know it's like a really typical thing for physics classes to do. I don't like doing that much because I think that I'd rather do like a demonstration of how I think a problem as opposed to how to solve the problem. I don't know if the difference is kind of subtle, but I might tell them like, what do we think about this? I don't know, a car going down the highway. So what ideas do we have? Like, what does a car do? Does it roll? Yeah. So then we write down like roll. Just like coming up with like brainstorming. And I could very well just like go like, oh, well, you have the 4 kinematics equations and you can figure out like, but I don't like to do that because I think that helps them only solve that problem and those particular kind of problems. But if I tell them like, well, what other things, like it moves, so there's some velocity. Is there velocity? Yes, we think there is. So, okay, velocity is a concept that's going to be important. What is velocity? Or you link position and time. So then you start like thinking like, oh, these are the relations between the concepts. And that's where that bridge between a concept and the other, I tell them that's where the formula is. That's what the formula just links you different concepts. But if you don't know the concept really well, you're not going to be able to figure out how to link those two concepts, because they might say like, oh, instantaneous velocity is one thing. Like, is it instantaneous or is it like the same during the whole time? Is it constant? And just like asking the questions, for me, I think it's a better use of class time, and it gives us time in class so that they can discuss things amongst themselves, and then they can come up with solutions for any problem, like even if it's not in kinematics, like they're going to be developing skills for any kind of problem that they have. So for me, just like picking really, really well what activities you want to do and what you want to tell them, that's the way for me to achieve that learning, and also to do it in a very efficient manner, because I had to learn how to be very efficient in my teaching by necessity, because this class is monstrous, the amount of topics that we have to cover. But I think that just like understanding that you're not going to be teaching them everything, but you should be teaching them skills that allow them to tackle everything. Like that if they have to learn more, I tell them like, maybe this is something that you're going to be needing in anatomy next semester, but we're not going to have time to cover this. So please read it, or please make sure that while you're studying anatomy, you go back to this material. And it's something that you tell them, like, this is a limitation. Like, I wish I could teach this class in 2 semesters, but we cannot. But if you tell them, it's a lot different than if you don't tell them. If they don't know, then they go to anatomy and they say, like, I don't remember any of physics. I don't think we saw this. Like, oh my God, her class sucked. Like, it was such a bad class. And it wasn't. It was just like we did not have time to cover the material. So I think that it's just like picking really, really well the activities. That helps a lot.
Yes. So one more question. Mm-hmm. Nice talk, Professor. How can we as students identify where we are not on our maximum capability? I feel that we understand max effort as max capability sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's another talk that I'm not qualified to teach. But in the sense that this is really part of this pervasive culture of science, I think, that we're like, we have to work and study, learn, like we have to keep producing. And I understand that that is something that's just how it is right now. And for me, it's kind of like a game that I decide to play or not, in the sense that like sometimes people work like all weekend and all night and all this, and we think that that's what makes them for very successful scientists. And then if we dig deeper, we start to see like, oh, but like this person never hangs out with their family, you know, like, or like or like maybe they see each other once a year and you're like, I don't want to live like that. Like, or they might just be like, oh, like, but this person has no other hobbies, like they just work. And I'm a scientist, like I know sometimes we have to do that in to advance on our career, but we should also be critical of that, saying like, well, I'm not doing things that make me happy to do my job, but am I really making the most of my job? If I'm not happy, like, am I doing my best work? So this is like a whole different thing in terms of how the culture of Western science or culture science in the world works. And I'm actually researching this in a separate way with a group of people from the arts, which is interesting. But what I would say is that it's really a cultural mindset that we have to change. And even if we cannot change this, it's really hard to change this on the broader scale. Like, but we can look at it from a different point of view with our own eyes. So we can change the culture that we decide to do. So I've learned this. I've learned a lot about this. For example, and this is like, this is a whole thing. So I hope people are not upset about what I'm going to say. I don't mean it in a bad way. But for example, we learn like, you know, men and women behave in a certain way. That's something that we grew up with. I don't think that's true at all. But some people might. In our society, at least in Costa Rica, that's kind of how it works. Like men and women do different things. And yes, they can go study and like work on everything, but you know, like women cook and men don't, or men, you know, that sort of thing. But if we look at like these younger generations are breaking that binary. And so you have people that are not just going to be behaving like, you know, like I don't cook in my house. My husband cooks because I don't like cooking and he does. And so that's it. Like if we, you know, other households, then both of them might cook. So that works out fine too. But for example, these younger generations are also, you know, like breaking that idea, like girls wear skirts and boys pants, and girls can also wear pants, but like skirts, like boys are never going to be wearing skirts. So the younger generations say like, no, why? Like I can be a boy and wear a skirt, like it doesn't matter. So that it's like, you know, like breaking down that cultural, and there you can see in different countries that there's going to be a lot of backlash. Like, you know, like I think for most of us, I think of my family is a very liberal family, but if my brother had showed up with a skirt, my dad would not have liked that. Like, they would not have liked that at all. So there's a lot of this opposition to that. But I've learned from that and from seeing that is that I really appreciate that breaking down that cultural barrier, because it's not easy, but it makes for a better world for everybody. You know, for girls wearing skirts, it's also good, and it doesn't hurt if boys wear skirts as well. But I think that so that we can understand if we're not using, or so that we can understand maximum effort as different as maximum capability, sometimes we have to break down the barriers as big as a boy wearing a skirt. So it needs to be, it's a big cultural shift. So it's not an easy thing to do, is what I'm trying to say. But I think it's a good thing to do, in the sense that it would help people become freer, I think, in their minds, and have better lives, I think, happier lives. because if we are studying all the time, we're not going to be able to develop other interests. And that's something I learned, the bad way throughout the years. I was very focused on my studies, and I wasn't as creative or as excited as I could have been about different things. And it was only because when I came back to Costa Rica and like went through this changes as working as a professor, and you would think that being a professor I'm busier than when I was a student, which is absolutely true, but at the same time I'm doing better things. So like I mentioned, like I'm doing this thing where I'm working on with artists on this topic, and it's not scientific research as I've done before. It's a different kind of research, but it's needed so that we can understand, so that I can understand these things that are related to feelings for scientists and that sort of thing. But I would have never done that if I didn't pursue like the things that I like to do, and just like painting and like hanging out with my artist friends and that sort of thing, and like coming up with ideas. So it's really like, if it's something that makes you happy, even if it doesn't become part of my work, like part of your work, like I make everything part of my work at some point or the other. But if it's something that makes you happy, it makes you feel more relaxed, you're happier, you teach class in a better way. So whether that's like painting or hanging out with friends or being with your family, then all that makes for a better scientist, as opposed to the current culture, which says that you should not have children because you're a woman and you're going to be losing time, and and like dumb stuff like that sometimes gets told to people in science.
That's exactly what I think.
No mindset. Yeah.
Ok. A gente, infelizmente, não tem muito mais tempo. A gente já estourou o nosso tempo. Temos até mais perguntas aqui, mas que eu vou te encaminhar depois, Mariela. Eu queria agradecer muito pela apresentação, por essa discussão de ideias aqui com a gente. E eu vou encerrar o seminário por aqui, encaminho as perguntas para você e depois a gente tenta responder. Muito obrigada mesmo, muito obrigada a todo mundo que assistiu a gente.
Can you show them the website for our
Yes.
So it's a network that we have. We do virtual exchange. So that at this point means virtual talks, like such as this one, and I do discussions on ethics, and I do discussions. We have one today at 3 p.m. Costa Rica time. So if you're interested, you can write us there. And the idea is that 1 week we might discuss ethics cases and like things that have to do with authorship or lab ethical behavior, that sort of thing. And then the other week we're also talking about scientific writing. And I am not an expert in scientific writing, but I'm a scientific writer. I write articles and that sort of thing. And I've learned a lot throughout the years, and I've taken many classes on scientific writing. So I try to share this with my students. And it's what I call this is a literary workshop for scientists. But what we're doing is writing papers together. That's essentially what we're doing. And it's good even if you're not writing a paper right there, because it's about looking at a text and asking questions and making the text better. So that helps with your own writing, even if you're not writing right now. I tell the students that it's good if they can join to at least see what we're doing with the text of the other colleagues. So yeah, those are usually in Spanish, but they can be in English as well. There's no problem with that. Yeah, it depends on the audience.
Okay, that's great. I think you have the website to see the details and okay. Thank you again, Mariela. And
thank you everyone.
Thank you everybody that's watching us. So bye-bye.